But I do want to talk about, I guess, the future of the Conservative Party. So let's talk about the leader. So she's been in for a year. How would you say Kemi Badenoch is doing as the leader of the party?
It's difficult for me to say because I'm not an avid viewer. I don't have television, for instance. I never have had.
Really?
So I never watch Prime Minister's Questions. So,
fair enough.
So to be honest, Prime Minister's Questions is not a good barometer.
No, it's not.
William Hague used to beat Tony Blair almost every week, but it didn't translate into votes. So I suppose my perception at the moment is that she's taking her time, and I think that makes sense because there's not going to be another general election unless some extraordinary event happens for the next certainly 3 or 4 years. Therefore, she has time. However, what I would do, and I don't think there's been quite enough emphasis on this, is and you can do this at an early stage, is to set out some principles. You don't have to set out policies, because policies can change. I mean, you may talk about, for instance, free school meal. Well, obviously, free school meals have recently been brought in, but building
X amount of hospitals. Let's say, that's a policy. Technically,
exactly. And then you come to 3 years' time, there's absolutely no money. So what's the point of having a policy?
The picture changes.
The picture changes. However, principles, you can say our principle will be that we will not borrow more than X percent of GDP. We will not let it rise. And we're not going to fudge around and say, counting capital expenditure is one thing and another. You can say we believe in keeping public debt manageable and declining because that is the right thing to do, because it stores up the ability to confront a future crisis if necessary, like COVID or financial crash. And also it means that you're not spending as much on interest. At the moment, we're spending more than double on paying people interest, and a lot of these are not British. It's not British borrowers, it's foreign borrowers. All that money going out of the country, we're paying double what we spend on defence. That is not a sensible thing to do. So I think you could say as a principle, we'll have that. Another principle would be we stand up for freedom of speech. And we are not going to allow laws to creep in which stop people from expressing, with the caveat I expressed earlier about people who are really trying to stir up hatred. We're not going to allow laws to come in on that. You could also say we believe in the principle of a health service that is available to all at the point of need. Now, you may say, well, that doesn't need stating. Actually, it's a principle that does need stating. That doesn't mean that the NHS is set in stone and can't be reformed. You can do a number of things. I mean, you hear from the Labour Party, you say, we don't want privatisation of the NHS. Well, as you know perfectly well, there's a huge number of private organisations who offer services paid for by the NHS.
Yes.
And why do governments do that? Because they're seen to be more efficient.
Efficient and cheaper.
And cheaper. So you can set out those principles, and I've only given you 3 there, but there could be half a dozen principles, and then say the policies will fit those principles.
Sure.
But they will come a bit later. So I would like to see a bit more of that from Ms. Badenoch. Other than that, I think you can. Let's not forget that pretty much every party leader starts off and tends to go down in people's opinion. Margaret Thatcher, people were talking about getting rid of her a couple of years.
First year or two,
Yes. Keir Starmer, he nearly resigned after 2021 elections because they were so bad. And he's now Prime Minister.
And losing the Hartlepool by-election.
Exactly. Exactly. You're absolutely right. So the Conservative Party, unfortunately, has had recently this idea that at the moment something is looking not very good. You sack the leader. Well, we can't afford to keep on doing that. They always think there's somebody better over the horizon. There may be, there may not be. But if there's somebody better over the horizon, that person better support the current leader and really work hard. And then if something happens and the current leader decides to resign, then there is somebody there. But what you don't want is constant whispering and constant saying this person is not good enough, in my opinion.
That's true, because
Other people disagree.
yeah, I mean, that's true. Of course, the Conservatives have been labelled as they are chopping and changing the leaders. Some was thought, oh, that's just part of the Tory election winning machine. They'll do whatever they need to do to win elections. But especially now with 120 or so MPs, even if it is not Kemi who's going to be Prime Minister, you need time for maybe the next person to build up that credibility. Or even if it's a new person coming in, to build up that credibility, so that if they were to step in, they would see someone genuinely challenging for the premiership.
And I think the reason people see in the new factor is reform. So in the past, you didn't have what many Conservatives would view as a viable alternative.
Yeah.
It was either Conservative or Labour, and therefore you stuck with the Conservatives for fear of, because that was the only alternative.
That's the only alternative.
But now that's not the case, as people see it. And that is where Kemi has a challenge that David Cameron didn't have, a challenge that Margaret Thatcher didn't have. She has seen, and she inherited this because she only became leader well after the election. She has got to find a way of saying, look, we understand why many of our former supporters are voting reform. We aren't reform. We're not going to ape everything that reform does, but we do understand the things such as very high levels of immigration, both legal and illegal, and we are going to have to confront that, and we are going to have to come up with a credible policy. At the same time, I think she can make a very clear distinction in the sense that the reform at the moment seems to be advocating spending in many cases more than Labour are spending, and yet reducing taxes. So the idea of putting personal allowance up to £20,000 would cost a huge sum of money. Now, how the markets would respond to a government that reduces the tax base and at the same time increases expenditure remains to be seen. So she's got to have a credible answer to that.
So when we talk about pragmatism at the beginning of this, how does, let's say, Kemi present a, let's say, moderate, sensible, pragmatic policy, especially in the world we're in now, where you've got the rise of far right and far left parties, not just in the UK but in Europe, and a politics of sloganism? How does Kemi go about challenging that? Because maybe she's not doing it this effectively now. How do you go about doing that?
It's a good question. I'm not probably the right person to ask, because I'm not a political guru or advertising person, and I would agree with you that sloganising and the sort of three-word slogans that proved so effective over the last 10 years have to some extent changed the game. But I think people, I think only when people, I want Britain to succeed, but I think we're going through a very difficult time at the moment, and I think our political leaders of all the parties have to confront that and say to their members and to the citizens of this country, there's no easy answer to this. And I'm not just talking about Britain. France is to some extent in the same position. The US in a slightly different position. We have got to face up to reality. I take Ireland as an example. In 2010, when I first was elected to Parliament, one of the things we did in our first 6 months was we voted through in one day a 3.5 approximately £1 billion loan to Ireland, because they had, as a result of the Greek debt crisis, then Ireland, Portugal were facing real problems. And so we made that loan, which, by the way, Ireland has paid back subsequently with interest. What did Ireland do? Ireland, and I'm not advocating this here at the moment, they cut pensions, they cut civil service pensions, they cut civil service salaries. They enacted a kind of austerity that was much stronger than what than the austerity, so-called austerity enacted in Britain in the early part of the 2010s. Yeah. As a result, they also had huge windfalls in corporation tax from all the American companies that decided to take advantage of the very favourable corporation tax rates in Ireland and set up there. So now they have billions of pounds coming in from Apple, the likes of Apple and Microsoft, that set up over there. combination of that means that Ireland has now got a budget surplus. It's paying down its debt. It's in a very, very good position compared with pretty much any other country in the European Union. But they had to take those tough decisions in 2010. That was only 15 years ago. We may have to come to a similar situation where our people we've got to, I'm not necessarily saying that it would be the same things, but it might be, and we've got to have political leaders who are prepared to do that and carry people with them. But that means everybody's in it together. So you would have to say, we want the broadest shoulders to bear the most. Now, there's always the risk that you do that, and then, if you like, the wealthiest leave the country. There's not much you can do about that. Ultimately, if you've got somebody who only lives in Britain because it's got a low tax rate, or only lives in Britain because there are favourable conditions, it's you want them to stay, but you can't base your whole strategy around keeping them.
Got you.
But I do think that conversation has got to happen. Will have to happen at some point.
Yeah.
And therefore, Kemi, to go back to your original question, Kemi Badenoch, I think at the moment is probably the political leader who has the most chance of offering that sensible but fairly tough message, as long as it goes alongside other things that people know need fixing, like art.